Now we're in chapter 6.1 and we're going to be looking at the greatest common factor and factoring by grouping. Our first objective is to find the greatest common factor. So the greatest common factor has two parts. The first part deals with the coefficients. So you want to find the greatest or the largest number that divides all of your coefficients. And remember, the coefficients are the numbers that are in front of our variables. And then the second part, we're going to find the variable or factor out the variable that contains the smallest power. So let's do an example real quick. Let's say I had 4x squared and 2x. And I want to find the GCF among the both of them. Well, first I'm going to start with the coefficients. The first coefficient is a 4, and the second one's a 2. So I want to decide the largest number that will divide 4 and 2, and it would be a 2. And then among the variables, I want to take the variable with the smallest exponent. Remember the invisible one here? So I'm going to take the x. So the GCF for this example would just be 2x. So again, it's the largest number that will divide all coefficients, and it's the variable with the smallest exponent. So let's go in our books to page 433, and we'll look at the following problems, starting with number 1. It says find the greatest common factor of each list of monomials. And for number 1, we have 4 and 8x. So let's start with our coefficients. Remember, coefficients are basically my whole numbers or my integers. So among 4 and 8, what's the largest number that will divide both of them? And we should agree with 4. Then we want to pick the variable with the smallest exponent. This exponent is 1. However, on the 4, there isn't a variable. Therefore, the smallest exponent is really 0. So I do not factor out an x. And the GCF is just 4. And in number 5, we have negative 2x to the 4th and 6x to the 3rd power. So again, let's start with our coefficients. So I want the largest number that will divide negative 2 and 6, and it should be 2. Notice how we ignored the negative sign. And then I want to pick the smallest exponent, and it'll be 3. So I'm going to take x to the 3rd power. And there's my GCF. And then number 7, we have 9y to the 5th power. And then we have 18y to the 2nd power and negative 3y. So again, we want to find the GCF. So we'll start by looking at only the coefficients. My coefficients are 9, 18, and negative 3. So I want the largest number that divides all of them, and that would be 3. So the first part of my GCF is going to be 3. And then I want to go through and pick the smallest exponent. Well, remember the invisible 1 here. So I have 5, 2, 1. Who's smaller? The 1. So I'm going to factor out the y. So my GCF is just 3y. And then last one, number 11. It says 16x to the 5th, y to the 4th, and then 8x to the 6th, y to the 3rd, and 20x to the 4th, y to the 5th. And again, we're looking for GCF. So let's look at our coefficients, 16, 8, and 20. And we want the largest number that would divide all 3 of them. And hopefully we've all come up with 4. 4 will go into 16, 4 will go into 8, and 4 will go into 20. Then for each variable, we're going to go through and pick the smaller exponent. So for the x, I have a 5, a 6, and a 4. The smallest will be the 4, so I'm going to write my x to the 4th. And then for the y, the smallest is a 3, so I'm going to write my y to the 3rd power. And my GCF is 4x to the 4th power, y to the 3rd power. Alright, objective 2. Now we know how to determine the GCF. We're going to factor it out of a polynomial. So here are our steps for factoring using the GCF method. first step, you want to determine your GCF. And then step 2, you want to express each term as the product of your GCF and its factor. Another way of thinking about step 2, the word factor means the same as divided out. So I'm going to divide out the GCF. And when I do that, I'm going to have the following result. I'm going to write the GCF on the outside of my parentheses. So GCF, open a parentheses, and then you need to tell me what is left over or what is still remaining. And that's the concept of dividing. Alright, let's go in our books to page 433, and we're going to look at the following problems, starting with number 33. It says factor each polynomial using the greatest common factor. And for 33, we have 12y squared plus 16y minus 8. So we're going to start by first identifying the GCF. So remember, the GCF is the largest number that will divide all of our coefficients. So among 12, 16, and 8, the largest number that would divide all of them would be 4. And then I want to take the smallest exponent. Well, I have a y squared, a y, and there isn't a y here. Therefore, my GCF is just 4. Remember, the lowest exponent would have been the 0. Since there is no y, the smallest exponent is 0. So there's my GCF. So then remember, write your GCF, open your parentheses, and we're going to divide 12 divided by 4, well, that is 3. I still have the y squared. And then 16 divided by 4 is 4, and I keep the y. And then 8, or negative 8, divided by 4 is negative 2. And this is factored. Remember, you can check it by just multiplying. 4 times 3, that gives me back my 12. There's my y squared. 4 times 4y, well, that gives me my 16y. And then 4 times 2, that gives me my negative 8. And then number 37, it says 100y to the 5th power minus 50y to the 3rd power plus 100y to the 2nd power. So remember, let's start by identifying our GCF. So you want to find the number that will divide all of your coefficients. Your coefficients are 100, 50, and 100. The largest number that would divide all of them, that would be 50. So then I want to pick the smallest exponent for each of my variables. So for the first one, I see y to the 5th, y to the 3rd, and y to the 2nd. The smallest is the 2nd. Therefore, my GCF is going to be 50 y to the 2nd power. And then remember, write your GCF, and then open your parentheses, and we're dividing 100 divided by 50, that is 2. Y to the 5th divided by y to the 2nd. Well, remember, keep the y and subtract your exponent. So 5 minus 2, that gives me 3. And then keep going. 50 divided by 50, well, that's 1. Y to the 3rd divided by y to the 2nd is just y. And then plus 100 divided by 50 is 2. And then the y's to the seconds cancel each other out. And here's my final answer. Alright, let's look at number 41. We're still factoring, so first we're going to start with our GCF. So we want to find the largest number that will divide 11 as well as 23. That number is only 1. When I look at my variable terms, I have an x squared, but on the 23 there is no x. Therefore, I can't factor out an x. So my GCF is only 1. Therefore, this cannot be factored. If your GCF is 1, then you cannot factor the polynomial. And then the last one, number 45, we have 30x squared y to the 3rd power minus 10xy squared plus 20xy. So let us first start with our GCF. So among 30, 10, and 20, we want the largest number that will divide all of them, and that should be 10. And then for x squared, x, and x, the smallest exponent would be the 1. So we're going to take out the x. And then y to the 3rd, y squared, And y, the smallest is y, so I'm going to factor out a y. So my GCF is 10xy. Open my parentheses, and I'm going to write what's left over. 30 divided by 10, well, that is 3. X squared divided by x, that is x. Y to the third divided by y, well, that is y squared. Remember, keep the variables, subtract the exponents. Minus 10 divided by 10, that's 1. X divided by x, well, they cancel each other out. But y squared divided by y, that leaves me with a y. And then plus 20 divided by 10, it's 2. And then the xy cancels out with the xy. And this right here is our final answer, and it's factored. Alright, objective 3. Now we're going to factor out the negative GCF. So it says the following. When we're factoring polynomials, we prefer that the first term have a positive coefficient. So the first term we see has to be positive. If it is not positive, then we're going to factor out the negative. So for their example, they have negative 5x squared plus 30. My first term I see is negative, so when I go to write out my GCF, the negative will have to be there. Then I follow the same steps. What's the largest number that would divide 5 and 30? Well, it's 5. And then do I have a variable? No, I don't, because there's no x here. So my GCF is negative 5. So they wrote the negative 5 on the outside. They opened their parentheses, and then they wrote what's left over, and they have x squared minus 6. Be careful with your signs. Positive 30 divided by negative 5 gives you a negative 6. And of course, you can check it by just multiplying it back in. Negative 5 times x squared, well, that's negative 5x squared. Negative 5 times negative 6, well, that is plus 30. So again, if your first term is not positive, meaning it's negative, then your GCF would have to be negative. Alright, let's look at number 51 and 55. The instructions say factor each polynomial using the negative of the greatest common factor. And for 51, we have negative 8x to the 4th power plus 32x to the 3rd power plus 16x squared. So the first thing we notice is that our first term is negative. Therefore, for my GCF, I'm going to take out the negative. And then I'm going to follow the same steps as before. So my GCF, here's my negative. And then between 8, 32, and 16, the largest number that would divide all of them would be 8. And then the smallest exponent is 2, so I'm going to take the x squared. So my GCF is negative 8x squared. So let's write our GCF. Remember, open your parentheses. Now we need to tell what's left over. So remember, we're dividing. So the negative 8's divide each other out. X to the 4th divided by x squared is x squared. And then 32 divided by negative 8 is negative 4, so I can write minus 4. Or you can write plus negative 4, your choice. And then x to the 3rd divided by x squared is x. And then last term, 16 divided by negative 8 is negative 2. The x squares cancel each other out. And here's my final answer. Then number 55. Again, my first term is negative, therefore I'm going to factor out the negative. And then I'm going to look at 12, 18, and 24. The largest number that would divide all of them would be 6. And then let's start with the x's. I have an x to the 3rd, an x to the 3rd, and an x squared. So the smallest would be x squared. And then I have a y squared, a y, and a y. So I'm going to factor out a y. So remember, rewrite your GCF. Open your parentheses. Now let's tell what's on the inside. Negative 12 divided by negative 6 is 2. X to the 3rd divided by x squared is x. Y squared divided by y is y. And then negative 18 divided by negative 6 is plus 3, or positive 3, so you write plus 3. X squared divided by, x to the 3rd divided by x squared is x. And then my y's divide each other out. And then 24 divided by negative 6 is minus 4 or negative 4. And the x squared y divides out with the x squared y. And this is also factored. Okay, 2 more problems. Let's keep going. So we're still looking for the GCF. We're going to start with number 59. It says factor each polynomial using the greatest common binomial factor. And we have x times x plus 2 minus 4 times x plus 2. This time our polynomial looks different. But notice that we have 2 terms here. Here's the first term, x times the x plus 2. And here's the second term, 4 times the x plus 2. What do we see repeating? That would be the x plus 2. So I'm going to write it with the parentheses. I see the x plus 2 repeating. So that is my GCF. So when I write my GCF, I have my x plus 2. Remember, when you write it, you always have GCF, parentheses, and then you got to tell me what is left over. That's your remaining. So I'm going to open a parentheses. Remember that when I'm factoring, I'm dividing out. So I divided out x plus 2. And who is still there? X is a term that's on the outside of my parentheses. And then when I divide out my x plus 2 here, who is still there? The minus 4. So this is x plus 2 times x minus 4. Alright, let's try number 65. So this time we have 4x times parentheses 3x plus 1 plus 3x plus 1. So remember, we're looking for what we have in common. I see a 3x plus 1 and I see another 3x plus 1, however is missing the parentheses. So let me put the parentheses around it. So my GCF is going to be what I see repeating, which is the 3x plus 1. Don't forget your parentheses. And then I'm a factor, so I have my 3x plus 1. Remember, when you factor, you need to open another parentheses. You're going to tell me what's left over. So think of it this way. If I take out the 3x plus 1, look for what's on the outside of your parentheses. Who's out there? 4x. And then who's outside of the other one? There's a plus sign, but there's no number. Remember, if there's not a number, it's the invisible 1. So that says 4x plus 1, and this is also factored. Let me make up an example real quick. Let's say I had x times x plus 2, just like up here, minus just x plus 2. And I want to factor. So I see that my GCF is what's being repeated, which is that x plus 2. So I'm going to write my x plus 2. Then I'm going to open a parentheses. Now who's on the outside of the parentheses? Well, there's an x. There's a minus sign, but I don't see anybody, which means it has to be the invisible 1. So this one would factor into x plus 2 times x minus 1. So remember, if I do not see a number, the invisible 1 is there. Whether it's positive or if it's negative, it depends on the sign. 65 had a plus sign. The one I made up had a minus sign. Alright, and then our fourth objective, which is factoring by grouping. Okay, our steps for factoring. The first step, you're going to group the first 2 terms together, and then group the second or the last 2 terms together. So group the first 2 terms together, and then you're going to come back and group the last 2 terms. When it says group, they're talking about putting parentheses around them. All you have to do is put parentheses. And then step 2 says you're going to factor the GCF from each group. And then step 3, at that point, you should have parentheses that look exactly the same, and we're going to factor those parentheses out. Let's look at an example. Let's look at number 69. It says factor by grouping. I have x squared plus 2x plus 4x plus 8. Now, in order to do grouping, I have to have 4 terms. In order to do the grouping method, you should have 4 terms. Therefore, even though you see like terms, do not combine them. Leave it as it is. So the first thing we're going to do is group the first 2 terms together. So x squared plus 2x, put parentheses around it, plus group the last 2 terms together, 4x plus 8, Then we're going to go inside the group. So our first group, ignore the second, just look inside the first one. We're looking for what they have in common, your GCF. X squared and 2x, well, they have an x in common. So I write my x, open my parentheses. And then remember, we're dividing it out. So x squared divided by x is x, plus 2x divided by x is just a 2. And of course, write your plus sign. Now we go over to the second group. What do they have in common? The 4x and the 8. Well, they have a 4 in common, so I write my 4. And then I open my parentheses. 4x divided by 4, well, that gives me x. And then 8 divided by 4 gives me 2, so that's plus 2. At this point, we know we're following the right steps for grouping because our parentheses will look exactly the same. We have an x plus 2 repeated, therefore we're going to take out our x plus 2. Remember, keep it in parentheses. Open another parentheses, and remember, is always going to be the term, the number, or the variable on the outside of the parentheses that's left over. So that x plus 2 is gone. Who's still there? X. This x plus 2 is gone. Who's still there? Plus 4. So this factors into x plus 2 times x plus 4. And the number 71, we have x squared plus 3x minus 5x minus 15. So again, we're going to factor by grouping, so we're going to put parentheses around the first two terms and parentheses around the second two terms, or the last two terms. So I have x squared plus 3x. I'm going to put a plus sign because that minus sign right there, that actually goes with the 5. And that's a negative 5x minus 15. Always add between your two groups. So again, I'll say it again. Always add between your two groups. The minus goes with the number, is really negative. Now we're just going to do the GCF method all the way down. GCF for the first group is x, and I'm left with x plus 3. And then GCF for the second group, well, remember, our first term cannot be negative. Therefore, I see a negative, so I know to take out the negative. And then between 5 and 15, the number that will divide both of them is 5. And I should be left with x plus 3. Our parentheses look exactly the same, so I'm going to factor it out, the x plus 3. Open another parentheses, and who's on the outside? X plus negative 5, or you can write as x minus 5. And then number 81 and number 83. 81, we have 3x squared minus 6xy plus 5xy minus 10y squared. And again, we have four terms, and it says factor, so we're going to factor by grouping. We're going to put parentheses around the first two terms, and then parentheses around the last two terms. And then we're going to get the GCF from each group. So for the first one, the number that will divide 3 and 6 would be 3. And then the smallest exponent would be x. So I have 3x, and I open up parentheses. 3x squared divided by 3x will just leave me with x. Minus 6 divided by 3, well, that is 2. The x's divide each other out, but the y stays. And then we're going to continue. The GCF for the second group would be 5y. And then dividing, I should be left with x minus 2y. We see that our parentheses are exactly the same, so I'm going to write my x minus 2y. And then who's left over on the outside? 3x plus 5y. And this is also factored. And remember, you can check it by foiling, and you should get the original problem. And then last one, 83. We have 3x to the third power minus 2x squared minus 6x plus 4. So let us put parentheses around the first two terms and parentheses around the last two terms. Remember that you always add between your two groups. So that minus sign goes with the 6 as a negative sign. Then we're going to run through and find the GCF for each group. So for the first group, the GCF is x squared. And we're going to tell you what's left over. And we should get a 3x minus 2. And of course, you can check it by just multiplying it back through. X squared times 3x is 3x to the third. X squared times 2 is 2x squared. And then for the second, I see the negative, so I know the negative is going to have to come out. And then the GCF between 6 and 4, the number that will divide both is 2. There isn't an x on the 4, so I'm not going to take an x out. Open my parentheses, and then negative 6 divided by negative 2, it's 3. There's my x. 4 divided by negative 2 is minus 2. So my parentheses look exactly the same. If I made a mistake, my parentheses would not match, which means I will have to go back and fix the mistake. In order to continue the steps, I have to have my parentheses exactly the same. So I'm going to factor out my 3x minus 2. And then who's left over? X squared minus 2. And this is also factored. Okay, this will conclude our video for 6.1. Please email me if you have any questions.